With that, I'll introduce our next speaker, Sean Fischer. So Sean Fischer is a doctoral candidate at the Annenberg School for Computation. His research applies computational and quantitative methods. His research applies computational and quantitative methods to topics in both sports and political communication. And today his talk is called Causal Effect of Playing Time in the NBA. With that, I'll hand it over to you, Sean.
Awesome. Great. So should be full screen. I really appreciate everybody being here, listening, and for the organizers being flexible as I had some technical issues getting set up. But I'm really excited to talk about a project that I started working on about 3 years ago, I'd say, about in 2018 as sort of a side project while working through coursework and all sorts of other research specific to my program at Penn. So what I want to talk about today is player development and what teams can do to maximize player development, especially what's in their control, how we can test different theories about that, and what those results look like. So I think for anybody who especially follows professional basketball, the notion that player development is a persistent problem is not particularly shocking. The NBA is a league in which there are only 2 rounds to the draft every year, to the amateur draft. And many players are selected when they are 19 years old, 1 year out of high school, if they're American born. And so there's only a limited window for teams to recruit young talent, but that young talent is still very, very young. They're still very, very raw. And so for teams to buoy themselves and remain consistently good, teams have to be very good at developing the players they draft. And the reason that it's so important can sort of be summed up in this logic. First, NBA players on their first contracts, whether those are first round draft picks or second round draft picks who get slightly different types of contracts, are paid less than what they would likely be worth in free agency, especially if they're drafted early in the draft. And so this means that if teams get draft well and they draft players who can become contributors while on their rookie deals, the value of that contract goes way up. And it's like an area where teams can sort of leverage a market. It's not a market inefficiency in the way base percentage was in 2000 in baseball, but it is a thing that feature that teams can exploit. Additionally, young players are generally unknown quantities. In the NBA draft, a few guys every year might be sort of deemed studs coming out of college. You'll get players like Anthony Davis or Karl Anthony Towns, guys who is like, you take that guy and he's going to be really good really quickly. And you see that. More recently, players like Trae Young or Luka Doncic would also fall into that category. But for the rest of the 50-something players drafted, they're sort of unknowns, and you don't know what you're going to get. We've seen in recent history the last draft pick, Isaiah Thomas, become an all-star and an all-NBA level player. We've seen guys like Draymond Green go from mid-second round picks to being all-NBA or all-defense caliber players. And so usually when they make a draft pick, they don't necessarily know what they've gotten. And so for teams to succeed consistently year after year, there's a big incentive to optimize the development of young players. And that obviously leads to having players outperforming their contract values. But also it clarifies decision-making at some crucial junctures. And that includes around the 4th year, when rookie players are eligible for restricted free agency, when teams have to decide whether they will match free agency offers for them. Additionally, if you start to develop your players earlier and you begin to know what you have in them or what a team has in them, it becomes easier to use them for trades, to acquire top end talent. It makes it easier for you to decide, I don't need to make this trade. I can actually stand pat. So there's a lot of reasons to emphasize this early career development. But what can teams actually do to maximize development? That's a really good question. So increased game time could be one solution. But the way where we come to this is by first realizing that teams can only control a small set of activities and situations. To that end, players have a lot of opportunities to refine their skill. We see that if you're an NBA fan, if you follow the summer workout videos that get posted on Instagram and Twitter all summer, and people getting very excited, right? That sort of emphasizes this point that players always have the opportunity to get into the gym and to pick features of their game that they'd like to either add to, expand, or refine. Teams, on the other hand, can only control a few features. But the big thing is that teams can control how practices are implemented. They can control their travel schedules. They can make in-game decisions. They can provide additional amenities. There's a few things. They basically control the team setting. But some of those types of decisions aren't going to be as impactful as others. For example, it's probably really important for teams to emphasize healthy nutrition and building more sustainable travel schedules. It's probably going to help athletes perform their best, stay healthy, but it's not actually going to help players improve in the terms of acquiring new skills or better adapting to the NBA and the difficulty of playing at that level. And so there are some insights from psychology and a few different branches of psychology that suggest that learning elite skill and continuing to refine elite skill is going to come down to getting as much time in real game context or highly similar contexts that are highly similar to in-game reps. And this is just because the game moves at a very high speed, and these in-game reps will provide them with situations in which they can get the feedback necessary for learning to occur. And that can happen both from understanding in-game outcomes. So did I get a good shot? Did I not get a good shot? Was my pass stolen? Was my pass not stolen? Coaching feedback in the game, and then coaching feedback and additional team feedback after the game. So video sessions and other opportunities for review. So that makes it seem like, okay, maybe game time is a good way for teams to support their young players and give them an opportunity to become their best sooner. And this insight comes back to a few big areas in psychology, like I said. One, playing is going to be associated with motor learning. And this is important because NBA basketball is very different from even NCAA basketball, and certainly different from lower level competition, including the G League. So players in almost any sport, but especially basketball, need to learn to use game-specific information in the environment to make quick decisions and actually execute physical skills. So they need to hone their perceptual abilities, and this is the ability to do that is greatly benefited by doing motor learning. Two, in-game activity settings are likely to help players to evaluate the affordances in what's called an action possibility. So basically, by playing at in-game speeds, players learn what they can do with their bodies and what they can do within space. And this is really important for them figuring out when a move is possible and in refining their movement. Finally, like I said, game-like settings, they provide many repetitions because teams will likely execute consistent schemes, especially within one game. Teams will use common defensive lineups or defensive orientations, or offensive lineups and offensive orientations. And like I said, when that's the case, it makes learning from what you do easier, but also games provide in-game coaching opportunities as well as post-game opportunities. And so we could hypothesize that high-intensity practice might also provide these types of benefits, but it would require sort of trying to meet these conditions. So how can we test this theory? So the theory posits a pretty simple link, and that's that playing time leads to better later NBA performance. But we know that the link is confounded. And so we know that a variety of elements and features are going to be associated both with early career playing time, but also later NBA performance. And so my theoretical model highlights these five additional potential sources of confounding, and that is high school performance and NCAA performance. The logic here being that players who are better younger are going to be given more opportunities, but likely they are also better, so their later NBA performance is also going to improve. Physical attributes are a likely confounder because players who come in a certain NBA type of body, ready to play, ready to match up with professional athletes, are more likely to get playing time. They're also more likely to be equipped for success in the NBA. And then also draft position is another big one here, where players picked earlier are there's likely to be incentives for coaches and teams to give them opportunities to some degree to save face, to justify selecting them, and also potentially for this reasoning of they will get better. Of course, we know that the higher up in the draft you are selected, the better a player you are, which in turn means the better you're likely to be later. And one final potential confounder, which I don't quite yet have a good test for, is early career NBA performance. Players who adjust well to the NBA, regardless of how much playing time they get, rather obviously are more likely to become better later NBA performers. And so this presents, though, like a theoretical causal model that can be tested via regression, which is helpful because it will provide easy to implement and easy to interpret results. So I'll go into where I pull my data from and how we solve this confounding problem. So the data are relatively large in some ways, but they are limited. I started by identifying the set of players drafted between the 2000 and 2014 drafts who played at least one season of NCAA basketball. And I did that because their NCAA basketball stats are publicly available, at least a certain selection of them through Basketball Reference. And so I collected these final NCAA season, final season stats from the NCAA, and I collected their physical attributes from their final NCAA season. And I matched that data set onto data about their NBA performance. So that included playing time as well as a few other features. And finally, outcomes are measured using 538's Raptor metric, which is an all-in-one metric based on box score components and player tracking components. The NCAA stats covered features like true shooting percentage, effective field goal percentage, win shares per 40, minutes played, their team strength of schedule, as well as how many years they played in the NCAA and whether they were an RSCI top 100 prospect coming out of high school. All of that was available from Basketball Reference, like I said. Raptor was chosen amongst the entire set of all-in-one metrics currently available in basketball, in part because it is not dependent on playing time. It's a rate stat, so it isn't based on just an accumulation like wins added would be or win shares. And additionally, it should not be sensitive to certain features like shrinkage or regularization that might impact the results. That being said, as a robustness check, I've also evaluated this on ESPN's RPM measure as well as Jacob Goldstein's PIPM measure. And there are in the works plans to extend it to box plus minus and the LeBron all-in-one metric from B-Ball Index. So applying all these conditions and looking for players who played in their fourth season, I went from 661 NCAA draftees down to 380 players. Of course, these players don't all receive even playing time. As we can see from the histogram, very few players receive a high amount of playing time in their first 2 years. The dashed line here is the mean. It's about 2,300 minutes. The solid line is the median. It's about 2,200 minutes. and there's a standard deviation of about 1,500 minutes for this distribution. Helpful context here is that over 2 seasons, 2 full NBA seasons of 164 games, a player could play up to about 7,800 minutes. So we can see that the average player plays about less than half of their available, of the available minutes. But we can see at the extreme end here, some players are playing close to, almost the entire available set. But that's very few. It's about one to 2 players at that point. Another way to look at this is that early career playing time is unevenly distributed even within draft position. So obviously if you go down any column, that's one single draft, and we can see higher picks play more in their first 2 years. But within draft pick selection, there is variance. So if you look across the number 1 draft pick slot, the second to last year, that's a smaller year. I believe that was the year Anthony Bennett was selected. He turned out to be a bit of an NBA bust. He did not play very much in his first 2 years. But as we go down, we can see for later ranks, there's more within rank variance there. Similarly, we might be interested in the dropout rate. So like I said, only 380 of the 660 make it to playing, have data available in their 4th year. And so of this, some of these issues, 177 were clearly identified as having dropped out of the sample. This produces a differential attrition problem, so we want to keep that in mind, that players drafted later are more likely not to make it to their 4th season. If being drafted later also means you're less likely to get playing time, that's going to produce some bias on the actual causal estimate. Finally, important to look at our outcome variable, year 4 performance. This is much more evenly distributed, looks much more like a normal distribution than certainly the minutes played distribution. Here, the median Raptor metric is a negative 0.60, and the mean is negative 0.82, and the standard deviation is about 3.23. So we want to know what gets players to the right side of the distribution, but we need to address all of those confounders. And so a first step is to use regression and to just control for them. And that closes off the back doors in those causal models, which means that the bias from that confounding is addressed. Additionally, if we, for when we're very worried about this type of confounding in the causal inference realm, we can apply measures like propensity score weighting or matching. Here, I apply propensity score weighting, but I have to use a novel method to do so because the treatment is continuous. It's not binary. Normally, we would, if you had a sort of binary treatment, something that was similar to an experiment, right, where some group got a high dose and some group got a low dose, but it was just group assignment, we would do something much more traditional where we would just model likelihood to be in the group. So instead, I use a technique called covariate balancing generalized propensity score weighting. I use a non-parametric implementation. The benefit of this is that it's robust to model misspecification. So if the propensity score model is not quite correctly specified, it can handle that. And like I said, it allows us to generate propensity scores for a continuous treatment variable. So this means we get weights that account for the fact that some players, based on these features, the potential confounders I've identified, are more likely to receive early career playing time. And so when we apply the weights, we hopefully reduce the correlation between the other predictors and the outcome, which is what happens. We can see on the left here, the box plot of the correlation between each predictor and treatment with weights and without weights. So we can see when it's weights, it's almost all 0. On the right-hand side, we can see this sort of arrow plot that shows the change in correlation when weighting is applied, and we can see they all go to 0. So with all of this set up, we can now get down to what are actually the effects of early career playing time. I want to start without applying weights. Regression alone with controls is a perfectly reasonable causal inference technique if we have a clearly specified causal model, which we do. The unweighted model, it shows that a 2 standard deviation more minutes leads to 2.44 more increase in a year 4 Raptor score. So important to understand in these visuals, any continuous measure has been twice standardized, so it's in 2 standard deviation units, making it more comparable to the binary indicators. And what we can see here, right, is that this measure, this effect, appears to be the biggest amongst those that are accounted for. And 2 standard deviation more minutes is about 18 minutes per game. 1 standard deviation then is about 9 more minutes per game. Do the results change a bunch with weighting? They do not. The result actually shifts down a little bit to 2.33 additional Raptor in their 4th year. And I want to pause here to think about what this actually means. And so what this is telling us is that in either specification, with or without weights, that if a player plays about 18 additional minutes per game over their first 164 games, that is sort of the assumption, their 4th year Raptor should increase by about 2.3 to 2.4, which is roughly 70% of the 1 standard deviation in 4th year Raptor. So that's not a small jump. That the magnitude of that increase is about the same as the gap between Jody Meeks and Kemba Walker in that data set. If you're an NBA fan, where Kemba Walker is, well, at least for the first majority portion of his career, was considered a high-level potential All-NBA regular All-Star type of player. If we think about the taking only a 1 standard deviation increase in playing time, so that's about 9 minutes per game, that gets us down to right about 35 to 36% of a standard deviation increase in 4th year performance. That gap is still, in terms of sort of a face value check, still gives us like a pretty meaningful NBA difference, where it's about the difference between Jody Meeks and Jay Crowder in their 4th years. So to sort of wrap up, this gives us some important actionable insights that can be taken to teams. One, it sort of indicates that in-game experience promotes player development. And so this means that teams who are in a position to do so, who are able to give their players more playing time early in their careers, are helping them advance and be better players when they actually have to make a decision about should we retain this player and at what value should we assign to them in restricted free agency. Second, there is sort of an implication, though, that stockpiling young players might be self-defeating in the sense that teams only have so much playing time to allot, especially teams that are still trying to be competitive and win enough games to make the playoffs and then be competitive in the playoffs. Having a deep bench of young players means that some of those players aren't going to get the opportunities they need to reach their best possible performance as quickly as would be ideal. And so in that case, it sort of might warrant changing how teams value the accumulation of draft picks, especially later round draft picks. And finally, this sort of highlights that while there's a lot of emphasis being placed on how do we come up with the best all-in-one metrics, how can we evaluate player value, player skill, features like that, it also indicates that there is some need for identifying metrics that can be observed that might help predict the ability to learn. And that might help also clarify some of these causal pathways about how does playing time actually lead to better later NBA performance. And that is sort of outside the realm of just statistics and working through that. There's obviously some psychology involved in that, different features. But I think there's also some big picture things about how this type of work might inform how we think about sports analytics and about decision-making in sports. And this sort of type of work changes how we look at a problem and say, okay, players are good or bad. Yes, sure. But teams can make decisions and decisions can be evaluated within this type of social scientific or econometric framework. And so that allows teams to sort of posit theories about what can we do to make players better? Can we try different things and then evaluate them and actually see without having to do costly experiments, right? And here the cost would be in terms of like, you don't want to randomize playing time because you might not win a ton of games and like that's going to hurt. So here's a structure that might actually be able to allow teams to try different things and gain insights without having to do experiments. And finally, all of this is to then say teams are in a position to then be active agents in this process. And it just sort of changes our frame to thinking about what can a team do to help a player? What can a team do to help itself? So I thank everybody for the time. I'm happy to chat further, take questions, anything like that. Thank you.
Cool. Thanks, Sean. Yeah, we already have one question. That's from Jared Fisher, different Fisher. So, in your graph, early career performance affects playing time. Couldn't the inverse always be true? Is this assumed a way to allow the model? So you had a graphic, maybe you can go back to.
Let me go back to that. I can pull that up here. We want to go to this guy, I think. Yep, right there. Well, or not. See, this is just easier, I guess. So if we go back to the graphic, the causal model here. So early career performance, I think that's a reasonable argument that early career performance and playing time are probably in some sort of feedback loop, where you start well, you know, with the minutes you have, you play well, you get more minutes, you keep playing well, you get more minutes. And so this sort of then feeds back on itself. And that's where sort of the next wave of iteration in this work, I think, needs to lie, is in disentangling basically that loop. And is it so much, you know, is thinking about breaking it out into components of a season, features like that, that could really help. And in a similar vein too, it's also about, we know not all playing time is equal. So a player who might get 10 minutes a game when it's garbage time at the end of the game is very different than a player who's getting 10 minutes in high leverage situations on a good team. And I think that also feeds into that sort of early career performance and how those metrics get calculated as well.
There's a question by Devin Becker. He's wondering if this could be summarized at a team level. So yeah, have you looked at this at a team level?
I have not, but this is, again, one of the long-term goals. The difficulty with the team level with just like the publicly available data is for a non-negligible portion of players, you do have team changes either midway through the season or during the first 4-year sample period. And so it sort of becomes, how do you want to assign players to team groups? And it could be something about thinking through, is it worth having fixed effects for any team they've played on and just like, you know, indicating they've played on only the Spurs, or did they play for the Spurs, the Knicks, and the Hornets or something like that. And so I think that's a big piece. I also think potentially with a little bit below a team level could also be the coaching level, to account for players who get their who play for different coaches. We know that some coaches are fired every year, so some set of young players are getting their first year with one person, their second year with another person, and luckily coaches circle through the league enough that should also be doable.
Okay, there are a bunch more questions, so oh no, okay, yeah, we should be able to get to most of them. Devin had a few more questions, but I'm going to just move on to other people's questions for the sake of fairness. So Sap Suzuka is asking, he said, great presentation. Did you consider garbage time minutes during your research?
So I haven't here. Somebody in another opportunity to present this brought up the same point, and that's on the to-do list, is to get into the, what's it called? I think that's in like the play-by-play, basically, or the event tracking or play-by-play data, whatever the NBA calls it now, that breaks it out, and basically allocate that every year. So that's on the to-do list, because I think what we'll see is that I can't imagine getting a ton of garbage time minutes provides you with the same opportunities that for learning and for development that getting regular run-of-the-mill NBA minutes would. So that's definitely on the list to be added to.
And Alexander Marcus asks, have you considered IV regression, perhaps with teammate injuries?
I had not, but that's actually a really interesting idea. Yeah, for those who, yeah, if you could justify all the assumptions, that actually would maybe be really, really clever solution, and maybe could also be help expand it. Thinking about beyond just the first 4 years of a player's career, but looking at players who get opportunities at different points. I'm definitely gonna have to think about that further. That's such I think a clever way into the problem.
Cool. And then the last question from Rachel Kratz. I'm sorry, I can't pronounce your last name. So from Rachel, how generalizable do you think these findings would be to other sports such as hockey or baseball, when early career playing time is often spent in amateur or minor leagues?
So that's a really good question. I think to some degree it is generalizable at the sense of the psychology, I believe, is itself generalizable. That athletes who are put in situations that are highly game-like, in which they are moving at game speed, are going to learn how to use their bodies in a certain way. And so I think, like, in principle, the theory holds up, in which case then I think it would be a matter of identifying the metrics that we want to, that translate in our reasonable comparisons across sports, and then rerunning. That being said, I would imagine that some of the issues here would be about, like, thinking about with these other minor league systems, thinking about it less in terms of maybe your first year in the league, but at certain age points, how much game time did you get and at what level was it? And that would obviously complicate, it would add complexity to the modeling of this, but shouldn't be an unreasonable lift. I also think that I have had some insight. I get to work a little bit with some college cross country people. And I think even for endurance sports, in sports where athletes have to learn to compete, like literally, like, how do I get through a race that's a longer distance than I did in high school? There's a similar element at play. So I think this should translate across a variety of sports.
Okay, great. Well, thanks, Sean. There's one more question, but I think you can actually answer it by texting in the Q&A chat.
Perfect. I was going to say, I can take anything else and answer anything there.
And yeah, of course, direct message Sean if you have any more questions. Okay, great. Thanks again, Sean.